Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I am springboarding off of a drama that I have been loving called 2521, starring Kim Tae-ri and Nam Joo-hyuk. Now if you have not watched this drama, I won't be mentioning any major spoilers about the plot, but there will be some details about the background of the setting and the characters introduced in the first episode. To give you a brief background, 2521 begins in 1998, just after the IMF or Asian financial crisis hits Korea. The sudden crisis has a huge impact on the country's economy, causing business owners to go bankrupt, like Peggy Jin's family, whose father suddenly owes massive debts to his former employees. But it also has an impact on schools, like with Kim Tae-ri's character, Hee-do, whose fencing team is disbanded due to budget cuts. Lee-jin is forced to drop out of university and work to support himself, while Hee-do has to transfer to another school to pursue her dreams of becoming a national fencer. Now, there are many videos already out there explaining the IMF or Asian financial crisis in detail, but I wanted to approach this video from a more personal lens, as 1998 was the year that I was born, and my parents were both going through their first jobs and employment during this crisis. I think in discussing this subject, it's impossible to leave out either my grandparents' generation, the post-war generation, or my own, the Gen Z/late millennial young adult population in Korea. So instead of focusing on a lot of statistics and numbers, some of which I will include, I wanted to give some of my personal theories and takeaways from the research and the personal testimonies that I've heard that are already out there about how the IMF or Asian financial crisis impacted the lives of Korean citizens on a more personal individual level. So, let's get started! So I'm not an economist or a financial expert. This video by VisualPolitik does a great job of recapping the crisis in English from a more global perspective, and I'll link it below. But to kind of summarize in non-economist jargon, here's my condensed everyday language version of the crisis. Up till 1997, Korea and other surrounding Asian countries were on an upward spiral in economic prosperity. Lots of foreign investors wanted in on these markets, and so they poured out a lot of money into Asian businesses, maybe a little more than they actually should have. This created an economic bubble. When a country steadily earns a lot of money, then has a sudden crash, which is exactly what happened to Korea in 1997. The Asian financial crisis actually first began in Thailand, when investors realized that a lot of the projects they'd invested into weren't actually being completed. But the ripple effects soon came to other surrounding countries, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and lastly, South Korea. One of the main problems Korea had was tying the Korean won to the US dollar too closely. I feel like a common theme in these world economic stories is the importance of the value of the US dollar, since it's a leading currency and helps measure the currencies of other countries. So when the US dollar weakened in a recession, so did the won. Basically, people thought the won was worth way more than it actually was, which made companies feel like they could borrow a lot of money from foreign investors, and they did, to an amount they wouldn't be able to pay back when the won decreased in value again. Now that the won was worth less, suddenly the amount that they owned to foreign investors was, well, massive. Yikes. Another problem was the Korean government. They were too involved in the economy at the time, and both the government and these business owners didn't predict the problem of increases in their currency exchange rate. The government basically encouraged all these foreign investments and loans without having a proper fail-safe backup for when something like, I don't know, an economic crash or a bubble happened. Now, I'll get a little more into this in another video, but traditionally the Korean government has always had a very tight relationship with the chaebols, these massive, huge mega corporations that used to run most of the South Korean economy. We're talking like LG, Samsung, Hyundai, Lotte, all the big names in Korea. Those would be the chaebols, the huge wealthy groups and families, the kinds you see in a lot of dramas. And if you think bribery is just like a Korean drama thing, this is very real. Monetary exchanges of favor between the government and these chaebols was very common. So when it became apparent that these private businesses wouldn't be able to pay off these foreign loans, the Korean government turned to an external solution that would eventually have further consequences on the country's economy. In the show, they refer to the crisis as the IMF crisis, as it's from the perspective of Koreans, and that's what they called it at the time. But on a global scale, it's better known as the Asian financial crisis, since it didn't occur only to Korea. Many of these countries are still facing the ramifications today. Korea actually managed to have one of the fastest recovery times, increasing its national GDP again in about 1 year. The show makes an accurate reference to the gold collecting campaign, where Korean citizens voluntarily gave up their wedding rings and other things made of gold in their households in order to basically fund their own country and bring themselves out of this crisis. This was one of the solutions implemented by Korea. Now, the IMF is actually an organization that Korea is a part of, the International Monetary Fund, and they kind of helped them recover from the crisis, but for a cost. Basically, the IMF bailed them out by giving the government money to repay these foreign loans. Now, this sounds like a nice idea, but free money always comes with a price. The government paying off these loans with more loans from the IMF meant starting this cycle of debt that would continue down the line of the Korean economy to today. This article, which came out very recently after the crisis, summarizes some of these issues that I mentioned and indicates the problems of the government interfering with the economy on this level. Basically, the article says that the government is not a business. Business owners who borrow money are motivated to pay them back because if they don't, they'll go bankrupt. But when the government borrows money, guess who has to pay them back? Taxpayers. At least in this case. Yes, the Korean government raised taxes on the entire nation, people with no direct involvement in these initial poor borrowing and lending choices by private businesses, most of which, by the way, were these giant mega corporation chaebols. They were the ones doing the bad managing, which in some way did have a better impact on these chaebols in the future because they were no longer just willing to hand down the line of power to their sons or to their children without proper education and training. And so the people were basically forced to help to recover from the crisis. Now, of course, the situation was pretty desperate. Everyone was being affected one way or the other. But just thinking about it in simple terms, if you borrow money to pay off money that you borrowed that you can't pay off in the first place, won't you just be tempted to keep borrowing money or getting help rather than actually improving your business practices and paying it back yourself? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but that was the projected problem by this article when the government offered this solution. The trend so far does suggest that this pattern of borrowing and buying on credit has only increased in Korean society despite the crisis. So how did this impact different generations of Koreans on an individual level? 2521 is technically about the millennial generation, which is a little younger than my parents' time. So I figured it's only right to include them as well. While Hee-do and Ijin are in their late teens/early 20s in the show, my parents were already in their mid to late 20s. In the beginning of their career, both my parents worked for the same company. When the IMF crisis struck, my mom was actually pregnant with me. Now, this company was big enough to survive through it, but they still needed to make budget cuts. And according to my mom, they gave all the married couples in their department a choice. One member of the family unit had to quit. And so my mom ended up quitting her job and moving to a smaller company. Now, while it is a miracle she was even able to find a job after that, it was still a time when pregnant/married women were targeted by social stigma in the workplace. So as the wife/mom, my mom did definitely feel the pressure to leave instead of my dad. And that led to a lot of spiral consequences because at the time, my mom really put a lot of her identity into her career. She was a very smart, educated woman, in a lot of ways defied social norms at the time. And so losing her job at the pinnacle of her career led to depression and other mental health issues that would carry on even after the crisis was over. For my dad's situation, I think it speaks a lot of truth to this article, which discusses the increase in wealth gap within Korean society since the crisis. Those with higher education and stable employment, like my dad's family, were able to manage through the crisis. Those already in low-income jobs were unable to recover quickly, if ever. But what I think really struck me was both Hee-do and Ijin's loss of opportunities and dreams that they had as young people entering Korean society because of the crisis. Hee-do risks losing her dream of fencing, while Ijin has to give up on university and his dream of working at NASA completely. IMF impacted innocent students and youth with hopes and dreams of a better future after a steady season of prosperity. Students studying abroad had to come home because they could no longer afford it, while students hoping to study abroad in the future couldn't even take the first steps. Traveling the world after graduation was no longer an option either. The Korean youth of the 90s were ready to take on the world, but many of their opportunities were robbed by the poor management of upper-tier companies. But many of these opportunities were robbed by the poor management of upper-tier corporations, many of which are now thriving again. This, being a fellow 20-something-year-old, feels like one of the worst consequences, even though I know practically speaking it's not. But it does make me sad that a generation that had so much to offer the nation was disadvantaged by other people's mistakes. And it really is something that shows in my parents' generation, a lot of whom, if they survived the IMF crisis, have stayed at the same company or have worked very diligently to support their kids, but didn't have the freedom to pursue their own dreams, which I think can be reflected in a lot of Korean parent-child relationships with people my age. We all know by now that history repeats itself, although not exactly in the same way. COVID-19 is seeing a similar wave of unemployment in youth in their early 20s, much like in the IMF crisis. Just like back then, the pandemic shut down small businesses. This isn't unique to Korea, but there are some economic/social trends that are. There has been a steady rise in both housing prices and household debt in Korea. Buying on credit is still very popular amongst young people, and there are many reasons for this. It can be for social mobility, to upkeep a certain image, to fit in with society, or it can be saving for the future by investing in real estate. Stocks, real estate, and cryptocurrency are very everyday norms for the Korean Gen Z/late millennial. Basically, anyone I know who is my age or a little bit older has dabbled in the stock market. Nearly everyone makes some kind of investment. There are so many accessible stock market apps, and I can't necessarily say this is a result of the pattern of borrowing from the 90s, but it still speaks to one aspect of our society. We still want to make the big bucks, and we do desperately want social mobility. And I don't know if this level of extremity is in other countries as well, but falling from grace didn't make us any less ambitious about becoming an economic powerhouse. And in some ways we've succeeded. Maybe because we were rising to the top once, we felt that we could again, and we needed to again, to make up for all the losses. But in their climb, Korea does still take financial risks. Now it's really easy for anyone, even with just a little bit of money, even young people and students, to make big investments. And the age of interest in these strategic investments are getting younger. In such an increasingly competitive society, both academically and economically, where the gap between the rich and the poor are just getting wider, the people in the middle are fighting to make it out on top and not on the bottom. Because the sad truth is that even those of us who are able to find jobs, our starting salaries in our 20s will never be enough to buy a house in Seoul. And if you want a comfortable car and good hagwons for your kids, taking out a loan is pretty much the only option. To raise a family in the same standards expected for future success, you'll need help. And a lot of young people are turning to stocks as a solution. For some, it's a desire to be wealthy, but for others, it's a matter of survival, as the economic society of Korea just gets more cutthroat and competitive. Lastly, I want to talk about the post-war generation, or my grandparents' generation, and this part honestly breaks my heart the most. The parents of the characters in 25-21 are a decade below them, but they are starting to enter seniority in this decade. Those who were running small businesses during the IMF crisis and rebuilt themselves up are once again facing the same crisis during the COVID pandemic. After losing their jobs in the IMF crisis, a lot of people turned to self-employment, running small businesses like restaurants to sustain their families. But with so much competition on the market, it's very difficult for these small businesses to survive. With Yurim's parents, we see how devastating the consequences can be of putting your trust in just one wrong investment. The risk is very high for small businesses in Korea, but many people still take out high loans in hopes of success. And many of these businesses fail within a few years. If you ever visit Seoul, you'll notice how frequently businesses change, with new ones replacing old ones, and it's been so much worse since COVID. Just by walking through Myeongdong, which used to be like the hot place of tourists, now it's completely dead. It's starting back up again now that the restrictions are lifting, but when COVID was at its worst, it was just barred windows and empty businesses everywhere. And a lot of small businesses, especially these mom and pop shops and restaurants, are owned by seniors. So unless you work as a 공무원, which is like a government official position, your chances of getting a good pension are pretty slim. So a lot of seniors also turn to self-employment after retiring from their jobs. That's why you see so many like chicken shops or small cafes owned by older people. That's kind of what you need to do to survive after 20, 30 years of working at the same company and they suddenly say, nope, you're too old, can't work anymore. So in my grandparents' generation, there were a lot of skilled workers who were just basically trying to find any work possible. And so my grandmother sewed clothes for a living, and she still does to this day. Of course, now with COVID, work has been nearly non-existent. Now she just gets by with her savings and maybe a very small retirement plan. But she's still one of the lucky ones. She managed to buy a small apartment and have property under her name before the pandemic hit. 40% of the elderly in Seoul live under the poverty line. That's the highest percentage of elderly poverty among all OECD countries. If you've seen dramas like Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha, where there's a lot of old people in the countryside, you might have seen like grandmas and grandpas doing all kinds of jobs, like fishing or selling food on the streets. If they are from the countryside, it's possible that this has been their whole lives. But if you're in the city, Korea is not kind to their elderly. It honestly breaks my heart to see how much of the homeless population in Seoul are elderly. Like, it's as if the city or their families stopped caring about them as soon as they were too old to produce income. And that is just another sad truth in Korea. As an employee, you just lose value in corporations as you age. Now, my grandmother on my mom's side was lucky enough to get a pension as a school teacher, but for my dad, who's in his 50s and is working for just a regular company, retiring from his current job where he's been all his life will mean that he's going to have to look for work elsewhere. Post-retirement depression amongst Koreans, especially men, is very common. When you've devoted your whole life to a company and they turn you out, as soon as you pass your potential for performance in favor of younger, healthier, more moldable employees, you don't know what to do with the rest of your life. And the lifespan is only getting longer. Whew, that got sad real fast. But for the conclusion, I will just leave this quote from Korea Expose. As much as I worry for my parents and their generation, and even my grandparents' generation, even my own generation, wow, I just worry for all of Korea in general. I'm still glad I had the opportunity to learn about how their past has impacted my past and how it's all this kind of chain/cycle of generations. And I really do hope and pray for change to come in the future. I don't want to get caught up in this debt cycle, even though I think living here, it makes it very easy to fall into that trap. I don't ever want to have credit card debt, but to not have that means either I'm an extremely smart spender, which I'm not, or I have some level of privilege, which I do. And so things to reflect on. But I hope this was informative and interesting. I say this in every video. It's like, do I want anything else out of my videos other than informative and interesting? I will try to be more creative for the next ending. And this was kind of a heavy/personal topic for me, so I will cut it right there. But thank you for watching. But I kind of wanted to give my own take as well as tell some of my parents' and grandparents' stories through this issue that's been brought up again by the lovely drama. So thank you to 2521. I will see you again in my next video. Bye bye.